All right, good morning, y'all. As Robert said, I'm Leslie Hazle Bussey, and I am delighted and so grateful for the invitation, Steve and Dana and Robert and Elisa, to share a little bit from our vantage point about school leadership. And as Dr. Pruitt did, I'll take just a short point of privilege to tell you what our vantage point is and what does GLISI stand for. It stands for the Georgia Leadership Institute for School Improvement, which is why we say GLISI, because it's a mouthful. But in our role, we are also a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. We are based here in Georgia. We have been here in Georgia for 19 years, and we are a leadership development and technical assistance partner to districts throughout the state. They come to us willingly. There is no state policy or requirement that our district partners work with us in any given year. We work with about 50 districts. They're distributed throughout the state across different regions. And please forgive my tablet that is talking to me here. I didn't even know that it does that. Across those 50 districts, we work with about 1,500 leaders a year, and that includes superintendents from our 180 districts. It includes principals, central office leaders, instructional coaches, teachers across the board. And we have the opportunity to dive in pretty deeply and get to know them as leaders and get to know the work that they're doing day to day. And so it's really from that vantage point that we'll be sharing some trends and things that we notice with regard to school leadership. In preparing for this, I thought about a couple of interactions I've actually had in just the last 4 to 6 weeks with some superintendents. One is the superintendent in a smallish, it's actually a typical school district, 7 schools, about 4,200 students. It's in South Georgia. And he is in the first 3 years of his superintendency, and he said to me, "Hey, Leslie, out of my 7 schools, 5 principals are in their first 2 years of the principalship, and they just don't know what they're doing. They need so much more from me than I expected." And another superintendent said to me recently in a larger metro district, "Our students have more opportunities and more exciting opportunities to do things through some of our career pathways work, but at the same time, we've had our highest rates of suicides or suicide attempts ever in our history." And just last week, I got a text from a district leader who was checking in on a school we've been working with where they've been leading a literacy initiative. It's an elementary school, and was asking how they're doing. And she said that over the holiday, unexpectedly, the principal resigned. She decided to retire early, and that no one saw it coming. So I wanted to share a couple of those examples of things that we were hearing as sort of an opener. Now, we are designers of adult learning experiences, and we feel that that is the primary value that we really deliver to our partners. We work with them in service, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. But because of that, it's difficult for me to engage you as a group of adults without inviting you to do just a little bit of feedback for me. And so I'm going to ask, based on your well-researched work in the education field, based on maybe some of the questions or curiosities you brought with you today, and perhaps spurred by some of the things I just shared, I wonder if you just take a moment to either think to yourself or talk with your partner about what questions do you have about school leadership, so that as I go through some of my remarks, I can just be responsive to that. So I'm going to give you about 45 to 60 seconds to just think or talk with your partner about what those questions are, and I'll invite you to share those. All right, sounds like juices are a little bit warm. would love to hear a couple of the things that you all just were talking about, other than you can't stand it when speakers do that. Yeah.
So both of us cover Gwinnett County Schools, and actually their principal pipeline has been the state has adopted it as a model that they're going to use. So that's not saying that it's perfect. I mean, we get complaints from people that even the principals who have gone through that don't have the exact credentials. So I guess one of the questions is, you know, what should you have to be qualified principal? And then the other another big complaint is the evaluation process, because it's so subjective. And so we both just did stories about Gwinnett had a performance-based awards just for teachers, and that's very controversial because the majority of the award is an evaluation, and the way that their evaluation process works is, from what I hear from the complainants, is that there's no recourse. I mean, if somebody evaluates you this way, then you just have to take it. And so those are two of the big issues that we see with this particular plan.
Yes, we'll definitely touch some on that and on the replicability and applicability of a model from Gwinnett for other districts in Georgia. I'll definitely talk a little bit about that.
I'm wondering about their role in helping teachers, especially new teachers, develop curriculum, particularly in districts that don't have, you know, their own whole package of curriculum.
Yeah, that's definitely a challenge, especially given how little experience our teachers have, right, in the classroom period. Any other, and we'll talk a little bit about the role of leaders and teachers and what is expected and needed from leaders to create conditions where, if teachers are being asked to create curriculum, that the results of that process would be reliable. Any other? Yes.
To ask about the issue of continuity when the very top level changes. I guess specifically the larger districts like DeKalb and Atlanta have had very high profile superintendents who are leading, and I'm sure in smaller communities there's maybe the same effect, but perhaps not so publicized. What are the ripples? I mean, how does that affect the individual classroom teacher or the principal?
It's almost like you're following me on Twitter. Thank you. Yeah, Michael, one last one.
The assistant principal pool, and kind of like who fills that, and what districts are using that pool for?
Yeah, the pool of assistant principals or potentially aspiring assistant principals. Yeah? Okay. Good. I'm glad to hear there's some good overlap between the things that I had thought we would want to talk about and what I'm prepared to talk about. So let's dive in to the very first question. I thought about these three buckets, and we'll meander to make sure we're touching on some of these questions that you all have raised. The first one is really a follow-on to Dr. Pruitt's presentation, which is the world is changing. And so in a changing world and in a changing set of outcomes, in what ways does leadership need to evolve? And we'll talk a little bit about what that means here in 2020 and moving forward from our vantage point. We'll talk a little bit about how is it that leaders become leaders, and what those ripple effects are upstream and downstream from what we know is already an issue with regard to teacher turnover. And then certainly want to share some examples and give some exemplar models for what is working, where it's working, and what we think is reason for optimism as we move forward. And then we'll look forward to hearing some more of your questions. So I'm going to follow on, like I said, Dr. Pruitt's observations about sort of the changing technological and workforce. There are some other broader social and cultural changes that we notice that concern us and that we think are really relevant in thinking about what is great school leadership, what is great leadership anywhere. And I would argue that every one of us in this room is a leader in some capacity. You lead within the relationships that you have. You lead in your families. You lead, certainly parenting is perhaps the most rigorous leadership endeavor that there is. But I want to just talk to you a little bit about some concerning data points that we've noticed with regard to changes in the level of connection, the level of isolation that we see permeating broadly in society. This is not unique to schools. These are things that we see operating, of course, in the schoolhouse, because the schools are nested in communities. So these are things that that certainly even employers, higher ed, everyone is experiencing. Harvard political scientist Robert Putnam actually wrote a book about almost 20 years ago now, and called Bowling Alone. He noted even then that there were some very concerning social trends, including a 43% drop in the incidences of families having dinner together, a 35% drop of people entertaining friends at home. And what we notice over the last now almost 50 years is researchers would very conservatively estimate that loneliness, chronic loneliness, has doubled, and some research suggests that among certain age groups it's as much as 40% of our adult population. I'll talk a little bit about why that matters as it relates to schools in just a moment. Of course, many of us have been hearing, and I alluded to a superintendent who noted that we're seeing escalating suicide rates. We're seeing it among every level, every age level, but particularly among 15 to 24-year-olds, we're seeing a 37% increase just in the last 10 years alone. And we have seen indicators that this, of course, is manifesting in our schools in a very real way. This particular statistic down here in the bottom left is from a study of teachers. And this was not a study that asked teachers how stressed out you are, because I think we all know, all of us might answer that question a lot. They actually collected saliva samples from this sample of teachers, and they looked for indicators of adrenaline and cortisol, which were elevated. Those are indicators of elevated stress, a physiological stress response. And 93% of the teachers in this particular study had that elevated stress response. And we know that emotions are mirrored. And so the types of emotions that a teacher is bringing into a classroom will set an emotional tone in the classroom for those students. But it's not just impacting teachers and students, it's impacting parents, it's impacting school board members, it's impacting other community organizations. Again, I said schools are nested in communities. We're in the third year, the CDC reports, of a drop in our life expectancy. And that drop in life expectancy is explained by what they call diseases of despair. There are three things. It is alcoholism, drug addiction, and suicide. So aren't you glad you came here to be uplifted by this? But this is the context in which our schools and school leaders operate. And school leadership, we think, is fundamentally a very human endeavor, because it's about how do you inspire teachers, how do you create an environment where teachers are learning and growing and feel safe, so that those teachers can create an environment where students are learning and growing and feel safe. But even if it weren't the case that we had all of these social and cultural pressures that we're exerting on schools, we would still really feel strongly about this role of leadership and what it means and what it looks like, because we think all leadership in any organization is about leading change. And if you're leading any kind of change, if you're leading toward a future, something better, then ostensibly you are leading toward learning. And certainly in schools, we know the core technology is learning. That is what students and adults in the building are doing. We know that learning, according to Ron Richard, who wrote Creating Cultures of Thinking, is with Harvard's Project Zero, that all learning, not just rote memorization, but true learning, where that change is taking place, involves thinking. And we now know, thanks to neuroscientists who do functional MRIs, that we can't actually think. It is neurobiologically impossible says Mary Helen Imordino Yang at University of Southern California, to think without feeling. So all thinking involves some emotion. And for that reason, we think increasingly, more so than ever, strong leadership is not merely technical, but it has to also be social and emotional and have competencies in that area. There's some other things because of that social cultural context. We think a lot about this notion of what is a leadership paradigm. And in a world where things are very technical and ordered, a leader paradigm that is very sort of command and control and centrally run may be very effective. But in an environment like this where there's much more complexity, we think that we would even challenge sort of traditional leadership paradigms. This quote from Margaret Wheatley does help us to sort of point to some of the underlying issues with how we have thought about leadership in the past and what it means. She notes that the causes of today's problems are complex, and if we assume that complexity, we can't look for leadership to bring super simple solutions. But nonetheless, we act as though there's not complexity. So when a leader stumbles, especially when we've got leaders who almost all of them are very new in their roles, we immediately fire him or her and start searching for the next more perfect leader, which of course accelerates that change. So we have historically thought about leadership as represented by this graph, and I think that we're seeing more and more of what Steve Pruitt even alluded to, which is what I call the mashup model. We're seeing more and more, I think the music industry is a really interesting source of inspiration. We've got hits where we've got folks like Lil Nas X collaborating with Billy Ray Cyrus, and I think that those are good inspirations for how we might think about leadership as really extending beyond and permeating what we think were previous walls. So leaders have to work not just within the walls of the school, not only with teachers, but to think about how do they involve and engage parents and other community organizations. We heard from Stephen and from Dana from her earlier presentation about the need for wraparound services. These are the kinds of roles that leaders would increasingly need to play. And so what, in addition to technical skills, might leaders need? We've turned to some research by Janet Patty and Peter Senge to identify these, to identify these competencies that we think are really critical companions to technical leadership. We're not saying that we should abandon management. We need to manage and administer schools smoothly. But to do it within this more complex world requires some more social emotional competencies around self-reflection and knowledge of self, around competencies in cultivating trustworthiness. So not me making you trust, I can't make you trust me, but I can understand what the antecedents of you conferring trust on me are, and I can work to develop those. Enabling and facilitating meaningful conversations, building generative relationships, not just superficial relationships. Again, think back to that culture of isolation and disconnection. School is one of the last bastions of places where people come daily for face-to-face connection. And so leaders who set the tone for that place to be a place of connection know how and have those skills to build generative relationships. They have that capacity to think systemically, to see their school nested within a broader, complex system. And particularly, they have a robust equity consciousness and that ability to really have empathy and curiosity in engaging a wide variety of stakeholders meaningfully in their school. So that's the first bucket about how do we see leadership, what is it, what's required. And I think it does go to the question you asked earlier about some folks don't have, they might have completed some basic preparation, but they might not yet have developed the full robust set of skills that make people feel as though leadership is happening, which is the lead into then how do leaders become leaders. And there's three things I want to talk about here. One is what we call the preparation myth, and this notion of a person can be kind of declared prepared. You know, they go through the checklist of things that are preparation, and after that checklist is all complete, bada bing, bada boom, they're prepared. District conditions. District conditions are a really critical element of leader development and leader growth. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about that. And then the notion of how much that leader's own growth is self-directed is really important. So this is just one way of illustrating what I just referred to, that often we think about leadership preparation might be a certificate program. It might be like things like CUPLA at Gwinnett County. And one thing we know is that while they're in that process, we agree they are not ready, and that learning is taking place as they're growing. But there is a point in there that we say they are now ready. The learning is complete. And then they go to lead, and they're in service. And at that point, our prevailing paradigm is that they're putting their preparation to work, and that learning and growth really isn't happening. And it's really indicative in the superintendent who said, I've got all these principals and they don't know what to do, and they're asking me to help them, and I don't know what to do. And so there's a lot more pressure on district leaders to be able to create those conditions in districts that are part and parcel of working there that help leaders continue to grow even after that point. And so I want to talk to you a little bit then about those ripple effects that were alluded to earlier of turnover. So many of you have seen some of these data. We know that the average Georgia principal has about 3.9 years experience. This is actually rather old data. They have conducted a new study, but they haven't released this specific state number for Georgia. So we're working with a little bit older data there. I suspect it's probably a little bit lower than 3.9 years. And if you assume that what that means is no principal in any given school has been there for 4 years, and that means there's someone new there at a minimum of every 4 years. The other thing we know is that that principal turnover has effects on teacher turnover, both for the good and for the bad. Sometimes we don't know that in studies. All we know is that when a principal leaves, it increases the chances teachers will leave by 17%. But what we're finding is really interesting is that we're now sort of downstream of this teacher turnover crisis, and we're starting to see some things really cascade from there to the point of your question earlier. And that is that we have principals who are stepping into the principalship with fewer years teaching experience. Right? Because we know teachers have been in the classroom for less time, and so who's around to become the assistant principal or the principal are people who have not been there as long as they used to have been. And those same people who now become principals who hadn't had as much classroom experience, of course, are actually moving into central office roles and superintendent roles. Anecdotally, talking with John Zahner, who's the executive director of the Georgia School Superintendents Association, one of the things he was saying is that these folks are actually increasingly coming directly from the school. So they're seeing more and more, again, this is anecdotal, but more and more new superintendents are being hired directly from the school level, which means that they haven't been in a central office role. They aren't sure how district office works. And so that introduces some challenges there. But in the last 3 years, of our 180 school districts, 54% of them have a new superintendent, and that is data up to the minute. It's based on 27 changes in district leadership just in this school year alone, and John projects that by the end of the school year in June, that number 27 will exceed the previous year's numbers. So we're seeing tremendous turnover at the district level. And why does that matter when I'm talking about school leadership? Because as I noted here, that in-service period, if we want it to be long, is a time when principals need to be continuing to grow their craft. This is a myth They don't stop learning. They do continue to learn, and we can either let them sort of learn by trial by fire, or in the better districts and the more supportive districts, that practice is supported. There's scaffolding that helps those principals intentionally continue to grow the kinds of competencies that will not only lead to them staying, which is sort of a bare minimum, but optimally, of course, when they're leading effectively, teachers are growing, students are growing. The final thing I want to talk about with regard to leader development is that leader development is personal development. This is really about adults becoming their very best selves. And I'm not going to become my very best self in an authentic way because you told me to. I have to really want it myself. And we can do a lot of things to incentivize that and create those conditions, but really it's got to be driven by me. And that's what I was talking about with that autonomy orientation. In many districts, the choices I have as a leader around what to do to develop me are dictated by somebody in central office deciding what it is that I need, as opposed to me being a partner in deciding that. And that is a whole learning paradigm that extends all the way down to students, and the degree to which we believe students should have choice and voice in what it is they're learning. It's no surprise if we don't give students choice and voice that we also don't give adults choice and voice, and that becomes a challenge in terms of authentic, meaningful leader development. And so, quick commercial, we would invite you to think about driving your own growth as a leader and as a learner. We have a toolkit that's freely available online. You can check it out here to drive your own growth in social emotional competencies, or share this resource with educators or friends, neighbors, bowling league teammates. So finally, I want to just end with a couple remarks about what is working. And this goes to some of the questions I think you raised about what are some examples maybe of programs that are working. CUPLA is very, very well, CUPLA being the Quality Plus Leader Academy in Gwinnett, is of course well known nationally. It is a program that is outlined in the top 10 issues report under issue 5. And there are many, many aspects of it that are truly excellent, but also difficult to replicate and or potentially not relevant for a district that is a tiny fraction of the size of a Gwinnett County. And so some of the things that we think, and of course the vast majority of districts that we work with are rural districts, that are more typical district in Georgia. And so these are things that really are drawn from the research, as well as our experience working with more smaller, less resource rural districts. That networked learning communities are really important innovation that we're seeing some really good traction with, where people are learning from one another but finding communities. So we're working, for example, with Emmanuel and Jefferson and Burke County over in the eastern side of the state. Similar districts, pulling them together, learning from one another. We can't think about school leadership development without also thinking about district leadership development. That I think I've argued that the district is a critical partner and condition setter that determines whether or not growth will take place. We think that learning for leaders needs to really take place in the context of schools, not sort of pulled out into some kind of esoteric classroom. I'm talking about in-service leaders, not pre-service leaders, that schools are one of the best environments for leaders to become better leaders. This notion of 70-20-10 design means 70% practice and reflection, 20% coaching, 10% sort of a theoretical classroom instruction. So if you're thinking about what is effective in helping leaders become leaders, it looks more like that. That leaders need to be engaged, just as students do, in making their learning visible and public. And that ideally, learning takes place in intact teams. In other words, a superintendent and his or her cabinet and his or her principals are learning together, not pulling one out here and there to then experience some kind of superheroic preparation and then come back and magically sprinkle the superheroicism back in their school setting. But it's ideally that takes place, that learning takes place as a unit. So some final recommendations. Some of these are recommendations around district action. Some of them are state things, but really thinking about recasting school leadership to be beyond school principals, because leadership it takes place and is enacted at every level. So thinking about opportunities for teacher leaders to emerge. Again, this goes, Michael, to your question around aspiring leaders and assistant principals, that if they haven't had any experience in the day-to-day work of the school in making decisions, those are practical ways that the burden of school leadership can be shared, and that effective practice can evolve. And then the only other thing I'll highlight here is engaging that same mashup, broader community of stakeholders in redefining leadership and really engaging. We've seen examples for Fayette County, for example, has just engaged in creating a portrait of a leader and engaging a wide variety of stakeholders to be part of that dialogue, so that instead of somebody else saying, hey, we're going to move from sort of this more traditional paradigm to a different kind of paradigm, people have really engaged in that dialogue together. So I think I've got about a minute, a couple of minutes for any other questions. Yep.
Have y'all thought about how do you encourage longer tenures in superintendents? Does that have to be focused on the school board or the superintendent, or what?
There are a wide, Ken Zeff, would you like to? I think that particularly, and again, I'm going to speak more toward rural school settings. I think the dynamics are very different in an urban setting, but that broader, but we still see a lot of turnover, and it is about that relationship between the board and the superintendent.
But even in rural districts, people turn up at the school board meeting because they're mad that you fired the high school principal or the football coach, and there's all kinds of cross-cutting pressures.
Oh, exactly. And in that instance, they're married to them, and that's part of the right. And so there's a lot of there's a lot of dynamics there to navigate. But to your question around how do you create conditions for longer tenure, I think it is a school board issue for them to recognize that superintendent tenure is very closely. There's strong correlations between tenure and school success. And so Alvin Wilbanks is a great example, but there are several other examples where the longer a superintendent is there and the less turnover there is, the more opportunity there can be for positive change to really take root and to stay on course toward that change. So to the degree to which school board members can embrace the role of maintaining that stability over preserving their other interests, I would think would be the better. Any other questions? Well, thank you so very much, and certainly invite you all to check out Bussey's work. Here's all of our social and website information. Thank you so much for your work in advocacy. I will say that I know superintendents and principals are very grateful for a well-informed media and the ways that you all portray and support our work.
Thank you, Leslie. Excuse me. So to wrap up our morning session, we're going to have our state school superintendent, Mr. Richard Woods, come and give us a status report on Georgia public schools. Superintendent Woods.
Well, good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be with you. I think this is year 6, so we've been around. We talked about stability, so I guess we've had a little bit of stability here with that, and I appreciate the opportunity. Again, I'd like to thank Dr. Dollinger and again Dana and all the partnership staff for this opportunity, again for what it presents. I think being informed is extremely important. And of course, education really is an investment, into Georgia's future, and I think that's something that we should all be very proud of. As we enter 2020, I think it's an appropriate time to look at, where we were. Let's reflect back a little bit, perhaps over the past several years, but also to think about the future of where we're going. What do we want to continue to see? Where do we need to improve? And just think about, of course, right now going into a new legislative session. What does that involve, and what will that mean as we do move? But I think that for us in Georgia, we are truly at a watershed moment for public education. We have a great opportunity, I think, as never before in my almost 30-something years in education to see true improvement and really to put our position, our kids and our in their lives in a place which we're actually preparing them for life, getting them ready for employment, enlistment, and engaging into our community. And that's something that I think we really need to make sure that we're focusing on. We get one shot with our children. Once they graduate us, then the K-12 system is where we're at, and when they move on into life. And so we want to make sure that what we're doing really has the benefit for them, because their success will be our success as a state and as a nation as we move forward. Looking back in 2019, we saw a historic legislative session in public education, and I do want to thank Governor Kemp and the General Assembly for fully funding QBE for the second year in a row, for doubling funding for mental health services at our high schools, providing every school with $30,000 to improve safety and also security, and looking at improving the school climate, which is extremely important in regard to being able to educate our students. But also, I think for our teachers and our certified staff, the $3,000 salary raise has been well received throughout the state and greatly appreciated. When we look at performance across the state, we have moved up to a record high 82% graduation rate in the state. I firmly anticipate that we will be nearing 90% in the days to come. That I believe is completely attainable across the state. And that, as I talk about graduation rates, I am not talking about just getting a piece of paper and walking across the stage. It has to be something that is transferable and that has meaning, and that will lead to the things I talked about for our children. Going to higher ed, whether that's at a technical college, whether that's at a university system, joining the military, going straight into the workforce itself, becoming either an employee or an employer. These are things we're looking at, and also being an effective individual within their communities. I think that one of the things we try to stress is how do our students, engage within their communities and become productive citizens as well. A 5-year cohort graduation rate is almost at 85%. So again, not just arbitrarily putting a 4-year, this is a one and done, but looking at this, we know that some kids, especially in some areas and fields, need a little bit more time, and that's okay. I think we see that within our higher ed program. We don't put a 4-year date on that, but we look at what is the end, and so that's something that I think we will continue to see continued growth with. And it's very exciting for us as a state. Georgia was ranked 13th in the nation for K-12 achievement on Education Week's Quality Counts report. So, I feel that we continue to do some things that are having those benefits academically for our students. We see this, that we continue to beat the nation in ACT and SAT scores. So, if you look at something and comparing our students outside of something other than the milestones, then we're seeing some good trends there. Speaking of milestones, we had a great year this year. We continue to see some upticks with that, and as we continue to improve with that system and really look at how we test, and I'll kind of address a little bit that later on. Our career pathway completers already have a graduation of 96 and almost really 97%. So individuals in certain fields and aspects within education, continue to do that. I think our military students who are engaged with us is about roughly 90%. So you look at a group that's highly transient, but yet they are performing, and I attribute that to really a lot of great work that our teachers and districts are doing. One of the things and programs that we have seen the most growth and success in is dual enrollment. Right now, we have about 50,000 students that are engaged. Now, to put that in perspective, when I took office, there were only 13,000 students. So we are looking at probably a 10,000 student increase as that goes. But it's really a great program. It has added relevance to our education, and the opportunities for our children definitely unheard of. I think this is one of the most successful things, and probably one of the areas that we are the envy of other states across the state or across the nation. But even though we've seen remarkable success, I don't want to paint everything as rainbows and unicorns and saying that it is a perfect world. We still have things that we need to address. We still have areas that we can improve on. And those are things that we want to make sure that we look at this, because as I go back, it's all about our children. It's giving them the opportunity to succeed in life. I mean, that to me is our job. We are preparing each and every student that goes in there and within Georgia to prepare them for life. In 2019, I had the pleasure of joining Governor Kemp and the staff from the DOE and GOSA in the statewide listening tour. This was really unprecedented, that teachers and education leaders were able to share their concerns directly with the governor of the state. To my knowledge, I'm not sure this has ever happened. I think we have tried to look historically, and we have not seen the level of dialogue and interaction with the governor, and especially with this office and GOSA and other entities across the state. But, Governor Kemp took time, he listened, and that is one of the things I will say, that it was not just, coming in and for a Photoshop and just let's look and have some pictures, but we have been talking about things that we have heard on and during these listening sessions throughout the state. And a lot of the things that we look at, we'll be, looking at legislation, has come directly from what we have heard from the citizens of Georgia. But I think, more importantly, the listening sessions were a small reflection of the renewed collaboration and cooperation between our offices and for us as individuals. To have a positive relationship between myself, the governor, and other entities bodes well for us as a state. I think that is one of the things, and actually talking to a couple of superintendents over the past day, that was one of the things that they reiterated. I tried to say, what can we do? What can we do to help? And they come back and saying, having the governor and having the superintendent talk, to engage, to say that we are on the same page has been very, very encouraging to them. Because anytime you have a positive relationship, such as we have, it only allows us to think about what we can accomplish together. Not doing things in isolation, not having perhaps, some conflict. Not that we always agree, but, one of the things I can say is that we have dialogue and we have conversations routinely, whether it's between myself and the governor or within our staff. And so I'm excited for us in education in Georgia. I think as I go back, to say that we are a watershed moment, really almost somewhat understates the possibilities we have. For us as a state, I firmly believe that the best is yet to come. We're seeing a lot of great trends, and I'm excited for, number one, our kids, but also for our teachers and their ability to actually engage with their children. One of the things I think that as I talk with teachers, they always go back and say, I want to get to know my kids. I want to get to know them. Because at the end of the day, everything you've heard and the things you've talked about today, it talks about building relationships. You cannot take that away from public education. We are people. We have to engage. And that's one of the things as a good teacher, like I said, we talk about things that you think about. Who was your favorite teacher? Who was the one that made a difference in your life? I can pretty well say that you do not remember that individual for the test that they gave. You did not go into their class thinking, man, I cannot wait to take Calculus 1 test or my final exam. But when you talk about teachers, you talk about the engagement. You talk about the personal impact that they have had, in their relationship with you. And that's what teachers understand. If we are to make that difference, we have to get to know these kids. Because every day life comes into that classroom. We cannot separate what goes on at home and say that once it enters the door, that it does not enter our classroom or our schools. That's just the reality of life. So we deal with a lot of things, and I think having that relationship and letting our kids know that someone cares means a lot. At every stop, as we looked at that, educators did express their appreciation to Governor Kemp and the General Assembly for the $3,000 raise. They said it will help, to help in retention and recruitment of teachers. That is a small part of what we look at, but it is something that does mean, and shows appreciation for the work they do. As we look, they were grateful also for the mental health services and expansion of safety measures and the fully funding of QBE. And so these are things that we continuously hear across the state. Some of the other concerns they shared, classrooms, and again, being weighed down by the overburdensome of standardized testing. What does that mean? What does that look like? And we are continuing to address that. The teacher pipeline. That concern that where we have 1 out of 2 teachers perhaps leave the profession by year 5. How do we keep these? I don't think that, I think someone perhaps said it best. We don't have a numeric problem. We have a retention problem. That's what we have to look. If we're losing 1 out of every 2, but now we begin to trend that up, then we have more and more teachers staying into the classroom. So we can keep that. So we got to look at not so much recruiting, but how do we continue to retain? And I think that's one of the things we have to make sure that we continue to focus on. Excuse me. The need for even more support and resources to help students dealing with trauma and life issues. Life looks a lot different than when I started. Things that we talked about, whether it's social media, the pressures of life, our family, our families deal with issues differently. I mean, we have a divorce rate that's between 50 and 60%. That's a big burden on our students. Again, as I said, what happens at home does not stay at home. It comes to us each and every day. And so looking at a whole child approach, thank you, is something that we are continuing to monitor and push forward. We had the opportunity, just for the record, I am not contagious, but medical science has yet to find out what can stop this cough. So just to kind of give you a heads up for those that are perhaps a little bit close to me up here in the front. As we look at the opportunity for the legislative session, we're going to continue to make progress in removing barriers for our students and our teachers. My team and I, as we work and engage with the legislators, the governor, lieutenant governor, and others, we're going to share, policy proposals that we directly heard from the citizens in Georgia as we travel throughout the state and continue to engage with them. We will be advocating for state testing requirements to become more closely aligned with the federal minimum and work to develop a testing system that seeks to address student educational needs. Again, not so much the old autopsy report that we've had for many, many years, but looking at a testing system, and again, we have a pilot that's going on, looking at some other alternatives in which we now will give teachers real-time data that they can use to improve students during the course of the year. Not to wait to the end and then pass them off to the next year. But what we do have to look within our testing system is to make sure that we look at both our students who need remediation to bring them up to where we need to be, but also those students that need acceleration, who are ready to move on. I think that as we look at success, and educational success should not have a cap. It should have an infinite ceiling, and that's what we want to continue to promote within our state and allow our students to really take off and go to where their ability allows them to move. As we look at this, teachers must have a tool that supports their efforts, as I said, and looking at things in real time so they can look at their children and make sure that they're doing the very best and having the tools that support that. We will be looking at robust teacher pipeline legislation, including a pilot to design a better teacher evaluation system. We must do things, as I said, what will keep our teachers in place. If we can cut that slide of saying that we are losing 1 out of every 2, you think of the impact. I think that you heard about the impact of teachers leaving, that turnover. Consistency does matter. But I think we need to make sure that with that consistency, it is quality and consistency joined together. We cannot separate those two, because I guarantee you, a bad teacher can do more damage if they stay in a school than a good teacher can do for a relatively short time. And so we have to, look at those things and make sure that we are having quality educators within our school, but also making sure that longevity is there and supporting them so it allows them to be the teachers that they want to be. The expansion of educational and life opportunities for students, some of which will include the expansion of fine arts education and instruction, and also to ensure the sustainability and quality of dual enrollment program. One of the things we're looking at is that with dual enrollment is making sure it is sustainable but also has a high quality. As you can see, as I shared, we went from 13,000 to 50,000 students in a relatively short period of time. So I do anticipate that we will see some legislation that will address that and how can we improve that, but also to give us a chance to look at what we are doing in dual enrollment to make sure that we are getting a quality education that allows the students to move into higher ed or the next phase of their life. So that's something I expect that we will see. To push for additional funding in transportation and school counselors. Again, counseling is one of the areas that is probably one of the most overburdened areas that we see within our state. And so we want to look at what we can do to help that profession. And also, again, to fully fund QBE. In conclusion, I think as I shared, we're at the moment we're experiencing unprecedented alignment within our state. To say that you have a governor, you have a state school superintendent, you have GOSA, you have the General Assembly, you have the state board, that really, and what I'm seeing is that we are becoming one. We are becoming aligned in our purpose, we are becoming aligned in the mission, and again, the desire to make sure that we are preparing our students for life. And because of that alignment, you have more synergy. I think you will see us move in the same direction. You will see continuous collaboration. You will see continuous growth that I think that it will continue to expand. Education in our children, this, as I've shared with others, is not just a Department of Education issue. This is a Georgia issue. For us within the state, we need to see that that education is not something we have to do, but it is an investment. That we can see that we are within our state, but it is an investment in the lives of our children. And as I've always shared with other individuals, if our children succeed, our schools succeed. If our schools succeed, our districts succeed. If they succeed, our community succeeds, and when our community succeeds, then our state succeeds. And that, again, is something we need to be very proud of. We are seeing great growth within the state. And this is an opportunity like I have never seen before in this state's history since I've been either a student, a teacher, an administrator, and now state school superintendent. But it's a pleasure to be with you today, and I'll field whatever questions I can, and we'll start here. Yes?
Let Ty go first.
All right, sure.
It's kind of a two-piece question on one topic, which is, the budget cuts. You were talking about both dual enrollment and transportation, counseling too. It sounded like with the latter, transportation counseling, you're talking about advocating for more money in that environment?
Well, I think that, we're looking at something of making some adjustments in the QBE formula. I think one of the things that potentially we could look at would be maybe some tweaks, not a general overhaul, but that may be an option, or repurposing some money. I think that, those are things we have to look at, I think, within our budget. We have to make sure we're prioritizing what really counts. These are some ongoing discussions I think we'll have, and we'll see where they land out. We do know, and it may be looking at other resources outside that maybe public-private work that may help out, especially looking at other funding. I think we've had some discussions of just trying to, I think use either Medicaid, Medicare funding, for increasing nursing, and how do we support that? We do have counselors at higher ed. That may be something we look at as how, maybe letting them maybe handle some of the work. What's it going to take to get into higher ed and allow our traditional counselors to do some of the more traditional leg work on that social and emotional, dealing with our kids one-on-one. So, I think we put everything on the table right now, and let's look at see what options we can.
And the other part of that, I'm sorry, was dual enrollment. It didn't sound like you were actually talking about putting more money into dual enrollment. Any containing costs?
Yeah, I think right now I don't know that we'll see any money put in, but I think that to my knowledge, we've never just kind of said let's take a step and see what we're getting out of dual enrollment. I think making sure that the quality is there, that the programs that are being offered are first class. It may mean that, we look at, is it something we need to see that maybe what we are offering we could pull or scale back on to some degree. But, looking at the cost, I think right now, as you look at the projection, it may be somewhat unsustainable with the current growth. And I think this will give us a chance to take a breath and say, okay, let's, look at where we are now and see what needs to be done, because this is a great program. I think that anyone, as you look at this is, offers our students some options to obtain college credit, to go more into higher ed, more debt-free. Looking at, always, with dual enrollment, I always kind of like the move on when ready aspect of saying, are our kids ready to move on? We don't want to put them in a situation that really sets them up for failure, because this program should be designed to really encourage and mentor success for our students, because not only are we talking about graduating from high school, but we have to have our kids graduating from technical schools and also in universities as well. That's something I think that we need to continue to look at. And I think for a good experience at the high school level, it will definitely open up doors for continued success beyond.
There is talk that you and the governor are going to collaborate on a bill that is going to either abolish or change the 100-point CCRPI scale, and that the governor is going to instruct GOSA to stop issuing A to F grades. Can you talk about the possibilities for those things?
Well, I think there's been some discussions of what the 100-point scale looks like and what it does mean, maybe making some changes with that. We have not had direct talks as far as a bill with that, but we are looking at options of what does that mean. To be honest, when you look at a 100-point scale in our accountability system, one of the things we looked at a few years ago, we had a study, I think, through UGA, and it showed that, when you drop Georgia schools into other surrounding states, we actually do pretty good. And so I think that, we don't want to undercut Georgia and its economic growth based on an arbitrary number. You look at what is the point of having the scale. Anytime you put an arbitrary number in there, you have to look at what it means. To be honest, I think as we've looked, there are schools that perform very well, but I don't think they've been truly reflective of the good work they are doing. Does the 100-point scale and does our accountability, does it line up? And I think we've had some questions about that really, what an 80 looks like may actually be more of an A in the 100-point scale rating. So, we want to be fair to our districts. Yes, we're going to be accountable, but I think we don't want to undercut what we are doing in Georgia. We don't want to undercut the success we're seeing. I think this year we had a hiccup with our CCRPI, which I think I was quite surprised on some of the downtakes on that because of the success we've seen. And I think a lot of districts were looking at that as well. We're going to continue to improve. We're going to continue to look at it. We want to make sure that whatever information we give our districts, that it is information that they can use to improve. That is ultimately what we are focusing on. Not a boot and a hammer, but how do we continue to uplift the schools? How do we continue to improve? What does that mean? And, for us, it's more about service and support. I think we get a lot more out of our schools if we're able to do that. We will be having some discussions, and again, that's something the governor and I have talked about. But at what point we will see legislation, I can't give you a date or say yay or nay on that currently.
Is the problem just that it's too hard to get an A?
No, I don't think it's too hard to get an A. If we wanted to, we could make A's out of everything, to be honest, if we wanted to do that. I think it's making sure that we have a realistic view. I think, if I'm not mistaken, and Megan, you might can help me on this, within the state, I think there were only 5 districts that actually had an A, or 3, okay. So I'm thinking out of all the districts, all the schools that I've seen throughout the state of Georgia, to say that we only have 3, and if I'm not mistaken on that, I'd say they were probably an A minus, not an A or just an A plus, but they were all A minus. And I just know that as I've traveled about, that's not a good representation of what we see. And as I shared, if you put Georgia schools in some of our surrounding states, we do a lot better. And so I think we have to be fair to our state. We have to be fair to our economic opportunities that are out there, but also, more importantly, to what our schools are. I think that, we tell them you basically have maybe, 10, 11 ways to, succeed, but then you have, 89 ways to not succeed, because everybody expects an A. Everybody wants an A school. But I think that we look at what are we doing to really improve. And hopefully, as we continue to look at that, we have to develop tools. I think, just about the same way with a test. What are tests for? How do we use tests? How do we use this accountability system? And I think it needs to be something that we can, give factual information to our districts on how they can use that information to improve those learning opportunities and opportunities for their kids. Okay? Yes, ma'am.
In your conversation with the governor, have you talked about his support of educational savings accounts, which may provide a recession and seem to be a threat to public education funding in Georgia?
Now, he has not brought that up to me. That's not.
Have you brought it up to him?
No, it's just not a discussion we've had.
What's your view on those? Do you feel like they are a threat to public education?
Well, I think that anytime you look at something that takes funding away from our system, then yes, it begins to has an effect on that. Our thing is, we look at, for the past couple of years, we've had education fully funded. But I would say this, as I look at our QBE funding formula, it's still a 1985 formula. Education looks a lot different today than it did in 1985. Schools and individuals, they do have, I think that one area that we have seen some success in that has been, with our special needs students, and I applaud that. I think we've done some things to help out our military students, which has been good. But, I'm here, I represent the state, and I'm the advocate for public education. So, again,
Is it fair to say that you would not support educational savings accounts?
I see no reason to justify it.
What have you heard the response been with the teacher raises and the possibility of that helping with the retention you mentioned, and also the chances of the 2,000, have you heard anything about that maybe coming up this session?
Well, I know the governor has mentioned that. I have found the governor that if he says he's going to do it, if it is within his means, again, this is something I think that is a broader discussion, because it does involve the General Assembly and the budget. If the governor, like I said, I anticipate we will see sometime in the future, now whether it's this year, next year, whenever, but I think, I firmly believe that $2,000 is coming. That's the anticipation I have. And again, as I said, that's also working with a General Assembly. So, they're the ones that, help, all that funding and allocating. And I know some discussions, which we already talked about with the, the cuts that we've experienced, but, across agencies. But, we're moving forward, and definitely I support that. I think that would send a good message to our educators. Yes, ma'am.
Do you think that there should be a statewide policy on transgender athletes, as Representative Singleton out of Sharpsburg is proposing, that the state actually set the policy on that rather than deferring to anyone else?
Well, in my potential past, I've always left that to the Georgia High School Association. I mean, that's why they are there to do that. They work with student athletes, and they work with fairness all the time. And with me, then I don't know that we necessarily have to step outside the purview of a law that's probably unnecessary. But I think our coaches and our high schools and associations can determine what's best for the state. Okay, I know I'm standing between you and what's behind door number 1 and 2 back there called lunch. But it's been a pleasure to be with you today, and if we can be of any help, please let us know. And as I said, we're ready for an excited year. I think it's going to be a great legislative session, and just hang on to your hats. It's going to be a good ride. So I'm really excited about it. Okay, thank you very much.